Thank you.
Okay, so that's the link to my notes. It is an Evernote, but you don't need Evernote to view it. It'll work on any web browser. So this is the citation for this presentation. So I'll put it on Figshare. Part of the reason for that is kind of putting into practice some of the stuff I'm talking about. So when you're looking at alternative media, stuff that doesn't normally get published in a journal, how do you get an impact factor for that? How do you get it published? Well, one way is to use platforms that are set up for that, and Figshare is one of those platforms. So University of Melbourne has some sort of license with Figshare, so they have their own, University of Melbourne Figshare account, which work to a single sign-on, or you can just sign up with figshare.com if your university doesn't have one, and that's where you can post, posters, presentations, videos that might normally live on something like YouTube, but if you want to get a DOI for it, stick it on Figshare, because it's all about that DOI, that digital object identifier. That's the key to getting metrics, that DOI. So whatever you're trying to get impact factor from, whether it be via AltMetrics or citation scores, H-index, etc., it's all coming back to where's the evidence, where's the proof? Well, the proof is being able to have that DOI, that digital object identifier, which does not change. In other words, it's always going to point to the source. And that gets collated in databases like Crossref or DataCite. So your journal articles will be assigned a DOI via one of those databases. So my presentation, if I just jump into it, it's a presentation within a presentation, but anyway, just to make things a little bit meta. I'm sure that'll keep Michael happy. So looking at AltMetrics, what is AltMetrics? Well, it just stands for alternative metrics, alternative forms of showing impact. So your metrics are basically about proving the impact of an article, an item, whatever it is. And most of this with AltMetrics, the alternative metrics, instead of it being based around citations, downloads, and journal impact factors, is based around social media conversations, number of tweets, number of Facebook mentions, number of LinkedIn conversations, etc. And so that's the integration with social media. So part of this is, part of the driver, I suppose, is about democratizing research and academia and trying to get it beyond the academic niche, because we lock ourselves into those academic journals, which no one except us reads. And what's the impact that we're showing? We're showing that Michael downloads my papers and I download his. What's the impact on society? Probably nothing. So that's where alternative metrics come into, well, maybe if we reach out to society, we can actually have some broader impact, and we can prove that by, 1,500 people have retweeted the link to my article or my video, etc. So hopefully it's actually having some broader impact. So what I tend to think of AltMetrics as, not as replacing traditional metrics, citations, etc., journal impact factors, because they're never going to go away, because that's what the university values, but it's a way of amplifying your traditional research impact. And so a lot of people, their negative response to AltMetrics is, that's just that social media crap, and I'm not involved in that, and it's not real research impact. Well, it's not what it's about. It's about amplifying your traditional impact and proving that there's impact beyond the academy. That's the quick summary. I'll go into slide 2, which anyway. So part of what I've done, this is just a bit of a model I sort of pull up just to give people a bit of idea. How does all this interact? How does it relate? This is my attempt at doing it using, just a standard graphic from word art, but anyway. So I guess what most people are concerned with is, what is my impact? How do I prove my impact as an author? So you effectively have your author impact factor, which is defined by your identifier in the main databases. So for me, I'm in social sciences, so the main databases where I get an author identifier is Scopus and in Web of Science, which for some strange reason they call it researcher ID instead of WOS ID. And then increasingly through ORCID, the Open Researcher and Contributor Identifier, which has kind of become a bit of a de facto standard. The good thing about that is it's not owned by someone else. So, Scopus is owned by, I can't remember which one of these is owned by Elsevier, and the other one's owned by another publishing company. So it's kind of vested interest. These are owned by big publishers, and they're about making money. And we provide our research and copyright for free for them, and then they sell it to the universities and sell it back to us, and we pay for it again to read it and gain access, blah, blah, blah. Whereas ORCID is not owned by anyone. It's open access and is an open platform, as it says, Open Researcher Contributor. It started around sort of 2012. So it's pretty recent, but it has had a huge uptake. And I think most journals now require you to have an ORCID or ORCID. I like saying ORCID because I'm from New Zealand. If you don't have an ORCID, then you're probably not going to be able to get your article published in a journal anymore. But it's kind of because it's this independent way of pulling together all your impact, your research in one place. So that's kind of your author ID impact factor, and you also got other ones like Google Scholar, which have it. It's probably the most comprehensive, but the most loosely defined, and in fact, it'll pull together anything, even if it's wrongly cited. So I found some of my articles with the first author being actually who should have been the third author, et cetera, on Google Scholar, because someone's accidentally, hopefully not intentionally, put it in their research database with themselves as first author when they were actually third author. And Google Scholar is quite happy to pull that up and show it. And it doesn't, track back and identify, oh, that was actually wrongly cited. So although Google Scholar is probably the most comprehensive, it is also probably the least respected as far as giving you an impact factor. And then there's been various ways of trying to democratize the process in some ways, because you can have one article which is incredibly highly cited, and then maybe that's all you have. Or all your other articles have never been cited. And so an H-index is giving kind of like an average. So it's more about trying to prove the overall impact of your body of work rather than just one really, really highly cited article and nothing else has any impact. So that's kind of like your impact factor. And then of course you get the article impact factor, which is based on the journal, counting number of citations, number of reads, number of downloads. So that's the impact factor of that particular article within that journal. And then, of course, you have a publication impact factor, which is, the actual journal impact factor. They all get assigned impact factors, which pull all of these together and give an average of all the articles across its lifespan, and they get an impact factor pulled out of Scopus, Web of Science, and Sumagio, etc. And so they'll get like an overall impact factor, and just by publishing in that journal, you get that impact factor. So that's why people go for the high impact factor journals, because suddenly that gets associated with you by publishing in there. Then, of course, you have social research networks, which have become really popular. So there's ResearchGate, which it's a little bit confusing because it started, I can't remember when, 2011 or something. It's relatively recent, maybe a little bit before that. But received a lot of funding from the Gates Foundation, but is not actually owned by Bill Gates. So the fact that Gate is in its name can be a little bit confusing, but it's not actually, Bill Gates doesn't own ResearchGate. He just gave them millions of dollars to set it up. So they have their own analytics, their own way of tracing impact of articles and of authors. It's not related to anything else, but it's another narrative you can put into, this is my impact. Here's my Scopus ID. Here's my Google Scholar ID. Here's my ResearchGate impact factor. So it goes into that narrative. Then, of course, you have other ones like academia.edu, which has kind of fallen out of a bit of favor because they got in trouble with Elsevier because they were, publishing material that was copyright open access until they got taken to court by Elsevier. And that's also when a lot of people lost a lot of faith in Elsevier, a bit like people lost faith in Blackboard once they tried to copyright online learning. Then you've got other platforms which become increasingly popular, like LinkedIn. So having your research on LinkedIn and the conversation around that, how many people have read your LinkedIn post about your article. One of the newer ones, which as editors, I presume you probably know about, but a lot of people don't still, is Publons, which is more about collating your stats and impact around your review activity and your editorial activity. Which is, gone largely invisible for most people. How do you prove that you actually are reviewing articles and you're reviewing articles in high impact factor journals, and therefore, you're a highly valued reviewer? How do you prove that you're actually an editor on journals? Well, Publons is one way to do that, because it pulls all those stats together and gives you a profile, and is part of, it's owned by Elsevier, so it's, pulls in your Web of Science research ID as well, but not Scopus. So the other area here is AltMetrics, alternative metrics, and these are driven mainly by these platforms. There's a whole range of platforms, but the key ones really are Twitter, Facebook, Wikipedia, YouTube, blogs that have been subscribed to AltMetrics. And F1000, there's a few others. So they're tracking things like if you tweet or do a Facebook post or do a Wikipedia article about your article or your research, and you link it to the DOI, so it goes back to the actual original article, that's key. If you don't do that, you're not going to get your impact factor. Then you can prove your impact on, number of conversations on Twitter and Facebook, et cetera, et cetera. So it builds that whole other narrative. The key is, if you're going to tweet about your article, make sure you put within your Twitter message, your number of characters, the DOI, because that's how it's tracked. If you don't include the DOI in your tweets, on your Facebook post, on your Wikipedia mention, on your YouTube metadata, on your blog post, then AltMetrics can't find it. They can't prove it. So it's all about that DOI. Sorry for the long-winded intro. A bit more of the background. Done an AG article about some of this stuff in 2018 with Patria and Linda. We didn't have that diagram in there because it's a journal article, and they thought that wasn't scholarly enough for their journal article. But anyway, it was based on that diagram, but the diagram didn't make it into the journal article. So I've got an example. I thought, what better way to have what's the impact of AltMetrics compared to traditional citations? Well, let's use an article and check it out. So this is by one of my colleagues here at the University of Melbourne, Tracy Ryan. You can see it's quite an old article. So this is a little bit unusual. 2011, this the kind of predates a lot of the activity around AltMetrics. The interesting thing about this article is the significant impact it demonstrates in AltMetrics, even though it is actually a relatively old article. So there's the link directly to the article. You can check it out if you're interested. I think part of the reason is because it's actually about Facebook. And so, because it's an article about social media, it's kind of had this life on social media as well. And it was quite an interesting article. It talks about the relationship between the big five, type of personality traits and Facebook use. I find it really interesting, actually. So shyness, narcissism, loneliness, and Facebook usage. So the key ones that it pulls up, there's another two there that's missing out. Most avid Facebook users, and I'm sorry if anyone here is avid Facebook users, are narcissists. It drives them, getting their profile out there, or they don't have any friends, and therefore they turn to Facebook, or they're incredibly shy and can't talk to people. And so those traits follow through, keeping in mind this is 2011, into high Facebook users. That's basically the boil down of the article. There you go. So Minerva Elements is the University of Melbourne traditional research site we need to put all your research into. So this is what that article looks like in our database as to showing its impact. So it brings in, the journal has an impact factor of 1.56, which is computers and human behavior. That's quite reasonable, particularly in social sciences. That's so you can't mix and match impact factors between different domains. So your health and medicine journals are going to have 10 times that impact factor. So if you want to match education articles, they have to be matched, and with education journals, which just by the number of people who are interested in what they're saying is a whole lot less, and so their impact factor is going to be less. So this is a Q1. In medicine, it probably would be a Q4. And then you can have a look. Okay, so it's had 638 citations on Scopus, 534 on Web of Science. That's pretty reasonable. And it's got an impact AltMetrics score of 128. And it continues to ramp those up because it's an interesting article and people want to find out what is the impact of Facebook, and are you a nerd if you work with Facebook. So what about AltMetrics? So what is that AltMetrics made up of? So if we go to the AltMetrics site for that article, and you can search for that article, find it on the AltMetrics site. And this is just a free version of AltMetrics. So AltMetrics, to get their full stats, you have to subscribe. So, they do have to make their money somehow. But this is the freebie version. So we can see of those 126 that score, and the score is represented by this colored donut. So the more types of social media that it has an impact in, the more colors in the rainbow donut. If there's only one color there, it means it was only on Twitter or Facebook or one social media. So then you can see it's mentioned on 4 news outlets, 5 blogs, 2 policy sources. It's had 43 tweeters, at the time when I took the screenshot. It had some Google Plus users before Google Plus got shut down. It's had 1,655 readers on Mendeley, 636 citations on Dimensions, which is kind of like another AltMetrics platform. And then you can see some of the stats of where have these mentions come from, who are my readers? So it was from Australia. So you would think that, a lot come from Australia, a lot from North America, because obviously that's where Facebook comes from, and they're probably interested in people slagging off their platform. So here we go to PlumX. So what is PlumX? It's this article on PlumX. It's another form of AltMetrics. They have their own, just like ResearchGate and Google Scholar are, have impact factors, but there's no relation between them, apart from if you have a high Google Scholar, H index, you're probably going to have a high ResearchGate stat as well, because obviously it's a highly read article, but they have their own versions of those. So PlumX is another form. AltMetrics was basically the first kid off the block with AltMetrics. So now, like I said before, when you're Googling, you're searching online, but it doesn't mean you have to use Google. You could use Yahoo still. I don't know if anyone uses still Yahoo. So everyone, like a Stanley knife, for cutting a box cutter, everyone calls them Stanley knives because, that's just what you call it. But, Stanley's only one company that makes box cutters. So AltMetrics has become the encompassing term. PlumX is just one of them. So you can see how this tracks on PlumX. AltMetrics is also a plugin on most journal platforms that you can, once again, just turn on. So when I was looking at the example that Michael put in the chat, there was a AltMetrics little box there. So it just tracks, once again, Mendeley, site you liked. It kind of has a mix of traditional impact factors and social media. So it's mix the two together to give an overall AltMetrics impact factor. So another kit off the black block is a newer one called Dimensions. They all have their slightly different take on things. So Dimensions tries to pull in things like, have you had research funding based on this research, and if you have, it'll pull up that Dimensions number higher, etc. as well. So it pulls from a few slightly different sources. The key ones are still social media, and it makes a mix of traditional citations as well. So each of these kind of pitches themselves as we're the ones to choose, because we give you an average of traditional citations, social media, and citations and non-academic publications, or we link in how you're doing in research funding. So that's kind of Dimensions pitch, but it's just another form of AltMetrics. So once again, it would just be a plugin you turn on in your journal. So this is a really interesting graph. I stole this, but I do cite it below there. Showing you the difference between traditional journal impact factors and AltMetrics. Key thing being here, I think this graph, which shows you quite nicely, that you can get an impact factor from AltMetrics very, very quickly. So just using my own experience, we had an article published in Research and Learning Technology in 2016 or something. And I got an email saying your article is now published. I tweeted the DOI. I mentioned in the tweet my co-author, she tweeted it as well. Within half an hour, we suddenly had an AltMetrics impact factor of 200 plus, which means that hopefully, over 200 people within half an hour of our article being published actually looked at it, read it, and we hope downloaded it. That would never happen in a journal. You've got to wait until it's published. You got to go and hope that your university is paid for it. Someone has to go and check it out, download it, read it. How do they even know it's been published? So you get these differences in the curve. You can get a narrative around an impact, and with AltMetrics, you're bringing that citation back to the actual original article via the DOI. So anyone who tweets on the link to that tweet saying, "Hey, read my article. Here's the DOI," they're going to go straight to the source. It's going to take you to the journal. So suddenly your journal is going to get better stats as well. You're going to get better reads. It's going to drive people back to the original, and hopefully, people are going to download it. So you're not going to get citations unless people know about your work, unless they download it. It's going to take you 18 months before you get any citations. By getting AltMetrics driving downloads quicker, that will then mean more people are going to read your paper. You're going to get more traditional citations later on. It's just a bit of a no-brainer. So, people who poo-poo AltMetrics sort of say, well, you're just gamifying, citations. I'm getting Mike to download, tweet my paper, I'm tweeting his. Well, exactly the same things happens with traditional citations. I cite Michael's work, he cites mine. We just have to wait 18 months before, it gets out there. There's no difference. And all we're doing is pointing people to the original article. So my take on AltMetrics is what we're actually doing is actually amplifying your research impact. And I think from a journal publishing point of view, you know, an editor point of view, it's a give back to the authors. It's a way of saying, hey, publish in our journal, we'll highlight your impact factor, not just on citations and downloads, but your impact factor on social media and AltMetrics. And then you can put that narrative into your progression document, blah, blah, blah. You're going for a new job, you can show from PlumX, our PlumX plugin, how much impact your article is having. So in a lot of ways, I see AltMetrics as a give back to the authors, because they're doing all this work for free. And you know, and in a lot of journals, they even have to pay, you know, an article publishing charge. So what's the give back? So that's a little bit of an argument I've actually had with AJUT, is they've been incredibly reticent to turn on AltMetrics, because the only one that counts is citations. Hey, let's give back to our authors. Anyway. So there's a nice little quote from Lambda, which I think explains it quite nicely. I'll let you read that. So the key really with AltMetrics is making that link to the permanent identifiers, the DOI. So you need to make sure that whatever you are giving out on social media actually has a DOI. Of course, journals do, traditional journals do, but you can get DOIs for non-traditional media using platforms now like Figshare, because that's what they're all about. And that will then get harvested into your university research, you know, data collection, like Minerva Elements that will go in via you can pull it into your OrcID, because you can link that to Figshare, you can link that to, you know, via the DOIs will just get pushed out and into your OrcID and into your traditional elements. So my recommendation would be, you know, where you start, there's actually quite a few elements that AltMetrics tracks. The key ones I would suggest are Twitter, Mendeley, Figshare, Publons, and LinkedIn. Focus on those, you're going to do pretty well. Proof. Okay, here's a really interesting article, and this is where these pie graphs have come from. Interesting, you know, you can actually see people's names. So the article here, someone decided to do some, well, Lambda obviously, research into the productivity of a healthcare policy faculty. So because all of this is public open access data for Harvard Medical School, no less, they could find out all the stats from all the professors from Harvard Medical School, find their citations and their impact factors on AltMetrics, and they compared them. And they showed that the professors who actually engage with AltMetrics have a higher traditional citation impact factor as well. So the proof's in the pudding, it correlates, you know, it just makes sense. So there we go. Oh, that wasn't quite what I wanted to do. I have some more info in my Evernote beyond that Spark presentation, which is a presentation within a presentation. But if I just jump through, what are the key platforms that AltMetrics platforms tend to track? These are the ones that AltMetrics does, but most of the other ones will as well. These are the ones here. Google Plus, it's still on their site, but it doesn't exist anymore. Pinterest, yeah, I'm quite surprised that Pinterest, you know, is had such an uptake. It's gone from being, you know, where you find how to knit a doily to how you showcase your latest research. It's my bias, obviously, that it's really gone up the rankings as to impact. So some of these other ones, F1000 is another alternative form of doing reviews. PubPeer, which, you know, I haven't engaged with, but it's another one which you can track. And even your own blog. So we have like a blog for Escalite. You can register your blog and AltMetrics will check it and see, yes, this meets our criteria because you're citing with DOIs, it's a whole lot of actual research rather than just, you know, having random blog posts about Michael's beard. And so we will now track it for AltMetrics. I'm not sure they actually have done the tell-all blog yet, because we did put it into AltMetrics, but we haven't heard that they've accepted our applications anyway. So that's just some background info. Too much of me talking. I'll stop now. Hope that kind of makes sense and was useful.